Hello, and welcome to this month's monthly webinar um, provided to you by Perry Johnson Laboratory Accreditation. My name is Michael Kramer. I am the Calibration Inspection Program Manager at PJLA. And as you can see, we're going to still looking at, of course, the 2017 standards during these webinars, and today we're going to take a look at section 7.4, handling of test and calibration items, and we're also going to look at section 7.11, which is control of data and information management. As always, this webinar is being recorded. If you would like to go back and listen to it, or perhaps have a colleague that may have missed today's webinar, shortly after it is presented, it will be uploaded on the PJLA website. There is a tab for recorded webinars. I also get a lot of requests when I'm finished with the webinars to get a copy of the actual slides without the recording, and I've been presenting that. Been forward to those of you all that have been requesting it. Been getting an awful lot of requests for these. We are in the process of actually just also not only the recording but also uploading the slides, just the presentation without the recording. On your tab box there, you should have a box there for questions. If any questions does arise, feel free to type them in there. I will go and look at them at the end of the presentation. Try to answer as many as I can. So again, this is real time. You can type the questions. Please keep them pertaining to the topics that we're covering today, which is section 7.4. and section 7.11 of the ISO IEC 17025 2017 standard. So section 7.4, it was also captured, of course, in the 2005 standard. And this is the handling of calibration items. I like to refer to this quite often as especially for doing calibrations at a fixed facility, calibrations or testing, as front door to back door. So items, they come into your facility, could be hand delivered by your customer, could be delivered. Perhaps you go pick them up and bring them back. They're brought into the facility, inspected, handled in a specific manner, may need to be maintain at certain temperatures, humidity perhaps, calibrated, and then eventually artifacts could be returned, samples could be disposed of. So as I stated, I call it front door to back door for fixed facilities. Those of you all that are also doing work on site at your customer's location, there's also applicable sections of this section that pertains to those types of calibrations and tests as well. So it's not just exclusively for fixed facilities. And you'll see one change here is specifically directed at work that is actually being performed on site at the customer's location. So overall, the section is intact from the 2005 standard, which was section 5.8. However, there is a change, as I mentioned, and when the customer requires the item to be tested or calibrated, acknowledging a deviation from specified conditions, the laboratory shall include a disclaimer on the report indicating that which results may have been affected by the deviation. And that's particularly, and we'll hit on that individually here in a minute, but directed at those test or calibrations that are being performed on site, perhaps in an environment is not as tightly controlled as in the fixed laboratory environment. So 741, and this is directly from the standard, the laboratory shall have a procedure. And you see I bolded that and sort of, so I always like to specify a procedure is something that tells you how it is done. A set of actions that is the official or accepted way of doing things. So the standard does require a procedure for the transportation, receipts, handling, protection, storage, retention, and disposal or return of test or calibration items, including all provisions necessary to protect the integrity of the calibration items and to protect the interest of the laboratory and the customers. Precautions shall be taken to avoid deterioration, contamination, loss or damage to the items during calibration, handling, storage, waiting in preparation for testing calibration. Handling instructions provided with the items shall be followed. So there is those of you all that are versed in the 2005 standard, there is nothing new here. So there's a whole lot of information though on this first clause. So we're going to dissect it a little bit on these next couple screens. So you have to have a procedure for the transportation, receipt, and handling. So basically, like I said, items can come in via, say, postal carrier, UPS. Perhaps you go out and pick up samples or artifacts from your customers for test or calibration. Typically brought in, received, inspected, that whole process. The transportation, receipt, and handling. Laboratory shall have a procedure. Also, procedures shall entail the protection, storage, retention, and or disposal. So once artifact or samples are received into the lab, the integrity of that artifact or sample will need to be protected. If not being tested right away or calibrated, perhaps there's storage and environmental criteria that needs to be taken into account. Once it's tested, it could be maintained in the lab for a little bit. And as in the case with a lot of testing and samples that are received, there's also the question of what to do with the remainder of that sample once it's been tested. Is it disposed of? If so, what is the protocol for disposing of a test sample? Including all provisions necessary to protect the integrity of the test or calibration items and protect the interests of the laboratory and the customers. So again, what we're speaking about here is mainly the customer confidentiality. Customer has items in your facility for testing or calibration. That is between you and the customer. The integrity of those items and the protection of those customers' confidentiality of the test that you have agreed to perform for them shall remain intact between yourself and your client. Okay, moving on with section 7.4, 7.4.2. The laboratory shall have a system for the unambiguous identification of test or calibration items. The identification shall be retained while the item is under the responsibility of the laboratory. The system shall ensure that items will not be confused physically or when referred to in records and other documents. The system shall, if appropriate, accommodate subdivision of an item or group of items in the transfer of items. So basically, unambiguously, and that typically means not to be confused with. So when it's tried to be depicted here at the bottom of the screen, a couple calipers, they look identical. So when they are calibrated, they're logged in, there has to be some sort of a unique identifier, or they're not to be confused with each other. It could be same make, model, everything else could be the same. However, have to have a unique identifier where one set of perhaps calibration data will not be confused with the other. So here's some examples. This is mainly here, I think, would be pertaining to calibration. Often these unique identifiers could be right on the, say, the manufacturer identification label, which is permanently a fact to a device is being calibrated. Could be a unit ID, could be the unique serial number. See that often with calibrations. The unique serial number, or perhaps a unique identification number, as in the example of the calipers, would be the unique identifier and differentiating between one and the other. You folks involved in testing, you have samples coming in. They should be uniquely identified, typically unique, perhaps sample ID, lot number. See a lot more of these unique identifications being performed electronically, i.e. barcoding, where even if an item has been brought into the lab, a unique barcode that could be scanned and provide the folks in the lab all the needed information that they need to know as far as the item to be tested. So the identification, of course, it needs to be permanent. So should not be something that could say fall off. So like I put here on the screen, no sticky notes or those sticky pad items as far as just sticking on an item, because they can easily fall off and perhaps come off and be misapplied to something else. Okay, this is where we're getting into a little bit of a deviation here from 2005. So this is clause 743. Upon receipt of tester calibration items, and I bolded here, deviations from specified conditions shall be recorded. When there is doubt about the suitability of an item for tester calibration, or when an item does not conform to the description provided, the laboratory shall consult the customer for further instructions before proceeding, and shall record the results of this consideration. When the customer requires the item to be tested or calibrated, acknowledging a deviation from specified conditions, the laboratory shall include a disclaimer on the report indicating which results may be affected by the deviation. So looking at that clause, going over to the next slide, the highlights there. So what it's talking about, highlighting deviation from specified conditions shall be recorded. Again, asking the customer for further instructions and record the results of the consultation and inclusion of a disclaimer. If the customer wants the item tested or calibrated anyway, the lab needs to include a statement with the results. So talking about specified conditions, what we're referencing there, and this is where we're sort of, I feel this is going to be much more in play now with those folks that are actually doing the calibrations on site or testing on site as opposed to at the fixed facility. So when we're talking about specified conditions, for example, if you have stated in your procedure the following environmental conditions required, and we'll say calibration for this example, in order to perform a calibration, that specified temperatures to be within 68 degrees F Fahrenheit, plus or minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Relative humidity to be less than 50%. Also would be included would be things such as the unit under test remains in the laboratory for a 12-hour period prior to calibration to permit thermal stabilization. This is an example. This is right out of the SOP that the organization is utilizing, with a note within the SOP that calibrations are not to be performed if the environmental conditions are outside the allowable stated limits above. So with calibration labs and testing labs, your fixed facility, if you're accredited to do a specific test or calibration, of course, that's one of the things that are going to be assessed in the facilities and environmental section of the standard, that you have the correct facilities to do that. So if there are any specific conditions that need to be maintained, of course, that's going to be verified during the assessment and also going to be part of the accreditation process. However, when you go on site at the customer's location, you're at the mercy of the conditions there. And that's where this may come into play, where you say you go into a facility, it's not a lab type facility, perhaps it's more of a manufacturing type facility. There's perhaps, they have gauges and perhaps like calipers, things like that are being used right on the production floor. And that's actually where you're be doing the testing. So that's most likely going to exceed those stated calibration procedures, those specified environmental conditions that are in this particular example that's mentioned here. So before I go on to that, so what that's saying, you go into a facility and it's out of those environments, conditions that you need to have a conversation with your contact there, inform them of the deviation, and gain their approval to proceed with the calibration. And if they're outside the specifications, that deviation, and we went over this back when we were doing the webinar on recording the results, that deviation needs to be specified on the report as well. All right, so I want to look a little bit here about testing when samples come in. Recall 743, or when an item does not conform to the description provided by the laboratory, you shall consult for further instructions before proceeding. This would be more in tune with those samples when the customer actually brings the sample into your facility. So untestable deviating samples are items which have been received by a laboratory by which are not in appropriate conditions to truly reflect the original sample. Again, just like going into a customer facilities where you're at pretty much at the mercy of their environment as opposed to your fixed facility. When a customer provides a sample, you're at the mercy of how they obtain that sample and how it was maintained after it was captured and perhaps brought into the laboratory. So this could be due to the samples not being handled correctly during transport or in a prescribed in the relevant standard, or the lack of essential information from a quality analysis to be undertaken. Consequently, the validity of the reported results may be jeopardized. So some things that may occur from a sample, perhaps being brought in by the customer, and you may be identifiable once the sample is brought in and examined. Things such as not being preserved adequately, having exceeded its maximum preservation time. In the case of microbiological analysis, lack the date and time of the sampling. Could be denatured through heat, light, or humidity. They have rotted or suffered microbiologically or have become cross-contaminated. So I'm going to take a recommendation here out of the Euromet Lab Cookbook number 3 for the implementation of the 2017 standard. And that states when a sample is taken by the customer or on the customer's behalf by an external provider and transferred to the laboratory cannot be responsible for verifying if the sample was taken in accordance with the relevant requirement. Nevertheless, a competent laboratory must not ignore any obvious observations concerning any adverse conditions of the sampling process, which might jeopardize the validity of the results. Just a statement that the results relate to the items tested and analyzed as received. Again, under reporting the results, that's what is required in that section. When the lab does not take the sample on their own, then it's specified as received, which means the customer provided the sample, which is used. Many laboratories is certainly not enough. In such a case, the laboratory shall contact the customer, inform them of the relevant problem, and ask for certain instructions. There's a clause in 714, which also has to be considered in this context. And this, of course, is, and we'll take a look at that, our review of request tenders and contracts. So one thing I highlighted there at the bottom is the experts. So when the facility sends you folks an artifact to calibrate or to test, and they're using your 17025, say, accreditation, as a qualifier to put you on your approved vendors list, they're looking at you folks as the experts. So, so the clause in 714 states, any differences between the request or tenders and the contracts shall be resolved before laboratory activities commences. Each contract shall be acceptable both to the parties and the customers. Deviations requested by the customer shall not impact the integrity of the laboratory or the validity of the results. Hence, if there's an obvious deterioration of a sample that was brought in, that deviation needs to be brought to the attention of the customer. So when the customer requires the sample to be tested, as the laboratory received it, it's the responsibility of the laboratory to perform the test. In such cases, the report shall include a disclaimer which clearly notices the deviation from relevant standards were observed and that the validity of the results can be affected by the deviation. This general finding could be further specified by stating something as the sample was supplied in packing which was inappropriate for the relevant analysis, or that the sampling date was unknown, or that the sample condition had deteriorated. That deviation from along with the as received, that the sample was as received, the deviation from the testing protocol from the sample should be noted. Hence, here's a couple examples of how that can be accomplished. I really need to have the conversation with the customer explaining about the deviation and how it could impact the testing. Okay, what items? We're moving on here. So clause 744. when items need to be stored or conditioned under specified environmental conditions, these conditions shall be monitored and recorded. So again, a record needs to be maintained. Is stated on that previous example, if you're required to maintain, let's say, temperature 68 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees F and less than 50%, and that's impact to testing or calibration, then a record needs to be maintained and monitored. Hence, typically see that done through something like a data logger that's depicted here. Where real-time environmentals are captured along with a historical history of the laboratory conditions, perhaps even having some sort of warning or alarm if it's being close to falling outside those required conditions. All right, so we're finished section 7.4. We're now going to move on to section 7.11, which is control of data and information management. So one thing, as I've gone through these series of webinars, and PJLA's done a transition in internal auditor courses pertaining to the 2017 standard. As opposed to 2005, when the standard was last revised, things are much more electronic today. Not seeing as many paper copies being maintained as we were in 2005. Hence, we have its own section now in the 2017 standard highlighting the control of data and information management system. So the entire chapter has been rewritten and adopted to handle electronic information. You don't see the words at all, things like list, forms, things like that in the 2017 standard. That implies paper copies. However, as you'll see here, the standard is still written where if you are utilizing a paper laboratory management system, you can still utilize that and comply with the requirements of the standard. So the laboratory might have information system applicable to electronics and conventional information. The system has to be validated and protected. So Clause 7.11.1, the laboratory shall have access to data and information needed to perform laboratory activities. So that'll be true if perhaps your technician is, or on the left-hand side, everything's being done electronically. I'm seeing more and more tablets being utilized by technicians. However, could still be handwriting the data directly into data forms. So the requirements for information management system are not restrictive only to computerized systems. Laboratory information management systems, but to any kind of system handling information. All right, and what I'm going over here right now is nothing new from the 2005. This was a requirement that was in 2005 that is brought forward to 2017. The laboratory information management system for the collection, processing, recording, reporting, storage, or retrieval of data shall be validated for functionality, including the proper functioning of interfaces within the laboratory information management system by the laboratory before introduction. Whenever there are changes, including laboratory software configuration or modification to commercial off-the-shelf software, they are to be authorized, documented, and validated before implementation. So, again, nothing new here. And we have a couple notes here maintained in the 2017 standard that passes on additional information. Again, note one, again, those folks utilizing paper management system. Laboratory information management system includes the management of data and information contained in both computerized and non-computerized systems. Some of the requirements can be more applicable to computerized system than to non-computerized system. Hear that term off the shelf. So these, when you go out, say you acquire a software provider, you buy their product, you're utilizing it in your laboratory management system, that's considered off-the-shelf software. You're not writing it. They're writing it. And we're talking about, going back here, validation. So what this is stating is if you're using off-the-shelf software in general, that does not have to be validated and is considered sufficiently validated. However, if you're writing your own, say, spreadsheets, or if you're utilizing off-the-shelf and you're modifying it to meet your specific application, then that needs to be validated. So particularly if you're writing, say, even your own Excel spreadsheet, for example, it's doing calculations, looking up data from different areas along the grid, a record needs to be shown that spreadsheet was validated. If you modify the off-the-shelf, again, a record should be maintained showing that it was validated. If you're just using it strictly off-the-shelf, then it's, as the standard states here in note 2, that should be considered sufficiently validated. I always get the question, well, how do you validate software? Basically, you just need to show that it's operating correctly. There's many ways to go about validating it. I used to actually, I ran a calibration lab, used to write a lot of, I go way back to Lotus and then Excel, where I would utilize them in my lab. I would have examples out of, say, NIST documents where they have examples provided. Basically, enter the same data into my spreadsheet and create the record that it's been validated. It's, of course, everything was matching up to each other. Could validate it longhand. Could be as simple as no real hard calculations are being done. Just validation, checking, assuring that it's looking at the appropriate lookup boxes or capturing the correct items. Again, a lot of this is nothing new here. 7.11.3, the laboratory information system shall be protected from unauthorized access, shall be safeguarded against tampering and loss, be operated in an environment that complies with supplier or laboratory specifications, or in the case of non-computerized system, provides conditions which safeguard the accuracy of manual recording and transcription. Be maintained in a manner that ensures the integrity of the data and information. In addition here, E, include recording system failures and the appropriate immediate action, immediate and corrective action. So E would include things in, once in a while we'll hear about the total system crash. Our system has crashed. So you should address that in case that was to happen. Call it sort of like disaster planning. How that would affect your laboratory management system. (7.11.4) when a laboratory information system is managed and maintained off-site. See this quite often. Or through an external provider. The laboratory shall ensure that the provider or operator of the system complies with all applicable requirements of this document. So one thing that pretty much when I think of this clause, the only thing that comes to mind is have to ensure that any confidential information that all service provider has, of course, maintains the confidentiality of that information that's the laboratory is providing and utilizing the off-site provider for. Okay, the laboratory shall ensure that instructions, manuals, reference data relevant to laboratory information management system are made readily available to personnel. So in other words, the staff shall have access to instructions of the laboratory information management system. One thing that I sort of, if I'm doing an assessment, I'll ask, well, how often is the system backed up? That should be something that should be readily known and should be traced directly to any instructions provided by the provider of the laboratory information management system. Calculation, moving on to 7.11.6. Calculations and data transfers shall be checked in an appropriate and systematic manner. So again, we could have pictured over there on the left, try to depict the paper entering of data. So when we're talking about data transfers, perhaps that handwritten data is then transferred into an electronic format. That checks need to be in place. Could also be done as on the right-hand side. Data could be entering directly into the report. So any calculations and data transfers need to have checks in place, and it's done appropriate and in a systematic manner. Okay, that's going to bring our presentation today to a close. So quite a bit of information there. Again, this is the time where I want to go back and give me a moment here as I look at the questions. And I think sometimes it takes a while to populate because I recall last month I did this and I was shocked I didn't have any questions, and it took a second to populate. So if anything comes to mind, go ahead and enter them into the your box where it says questions. And currently I am not seeing anything. I hope everything's working okay. And we'll take this time to answer any. I'm going to give it a minute or two here because I am showing nothing right now. Like I said, last month, I remember I saw the same thing, and it took a minute or two to begin populating. So I'll give it a couple minutes here, and here we go. Thank you. Well, maybe that's the reason. Had a gentleman tell me everything was pretty straightforward, so that's great. Give it some more time. Anything that went did be good just to see that was working okay. I didn't see any questions at all, but hope I did a good job. It conveyed things accurately and clearly to you folks, and they were getting some things now. Yep, it's populating now, so I don't know if it was just writing them now or. Okay, I'll go ahead and hit this first one. Is there any specifics about retention of written records transferred to electronic form? Again, with the sections that we went over as far as retention, it has to be addressed, but as far as that actual retention time is not addressed in the standard. However, in the standard, if you recall, we have a section on records. So when you're recording data, and I like to say where the pen hits the paper, you're creating a record. So you need to maintain enough information where need be, go back and enter, recreate the testing or calibration within capturing all the appropriate information, environmentals, who did it, what equipment was used. Where need be, you can go back and duplicate the test or calibration. But there is no, within the standard, any specifics about that other than what I just mentioned, that they need to be maintained. How do laboratories check the data transfers and document thereof? And again, we're talking about laboratories. We have some very small labs, and that I personally assess, and I'll talk about what I see out there, and then I see some larger ones. I see also, and if you think about it, this folks that are still doing paper copies, but one thing you have to put on the report is the individual who is authorizing the report. That could be also the same person that is doing the test in some of these examples that I've actually seen. It needs to be indicated on the report who's authorizing the report. Also, the date of issue now needs to be on the report. So let me go. So that's up to the laboratory as far as how they do it. The standard doesn't say, it needs to be done in a symptomatic manner. Only that ever get into different sections of the standard here. Whoever authorized the report needs to be captured, and also the date of issue needs to be captured. And then point blank during the assessment, that is something, particularly if for smaller organizations, that I would just ask. Bear with me as I scroll down here. Just talking about backups, laboratory information is done outside the manufacturer. What would you expect to see? Document it regarding these backups. Again, I would be looking for the instructions. What's required is access to the instructions of the laboratory information management system that's maintained off-site. So I'd be looking for consistency there between what was said and actually what was presented in the instructions. This one here, it's not really a question, I guess. It's just something individuals having to deal with. Offsite, I need leverage with management over using a sister company IT department as offsite storage because I'm trying to protect confidentiality. Well, that would be expected, that confidentiality, and if you need any leverage as far as conveying the requirement of the confidentiality of information and the requirements that are within 17025, I would bring those requirements forth to management. Of course, if I was on your side of the table. This one about validating software. I've always had a hard time in audits for the validation of commercial software. Again, commercial software is considered to be sufficiently validated unless you modify it. So I want to know if you had any recommendations for validate an Excel document with formulas as values, etc. And I think I sort of, and that came from, how I used to do it when I was writing my own Excel spreadsheets. Of course, even way back when, we still had to validate the software that, and I literally, and this is just the way I used to do it. There's other ways you could actually I've actually seen calculations done longhand and see if the information calculations are done correctly. Stated I would have examples from, in my case, NIST handbooks that I utilized, which had examples worked out in them. Utilize those examples. See if I got the same results. Of course, if it did, staple a copy of the out of the page, which I used in my validation as my record of validation. I just want to hear, you're going into how another question here, I'm sorry. How deep do you need to go in the validation? Of course, 17025 requires the system to be validated. 17025 aside, if you think about it, the results that you're producing your customer, if it's tied into your software and the calculations are being done, and that's the end product that you're providing your customer, I would put the onus on the lab there. I'm looking for a record that it was validated. How far you need to go and deep, I would put on the lab there. As far as perhaps what I just stated may not be enough for your particular organization, that you need to perhaps validate it against different scenarios, extreme conditions, things like that. My slides should be available for our records. Had a conversation with folks in our offices, and we did talk about this because I do get a lot of requests just for the slides. And I believe they are going to be up on the website, not just the recorded versions, but the slides. Again, if they are not, if this is not available, it's meant to check that before I logged on today. I'll certainly see if the other ones have been captured. Send me an email, and I'll be happy to send it to you. That's M. Kramer, Kramer, at PJ Labs, with an S at the end, .com. M. Kramer at PJLabs.com. I'll be happy to shoot anybody a copy of this presentation. Again, I know the recorded version is there. We may already started putting the slides there. There's a kind of a long question here. Let me try to digest the whole thing here. Can I maintain adherence to the standard and still use a sister company offsite if a storage maybe if the data is encrypted. I don't see anything glowing that would prevent you from utilizing the sister company for information data. There's an interesting, as found calibration test to be not conducted. Can this be deemed a deviation? Clearly, does this go against, excuse me, I sort of lost my place there. I apologize. I've completely lost my place here. Okay. Individual here was asking about for calibration and has found data, and that the client are requesting not to have the as found data there. Sort of goes against the requirement of the calibration process. Again, if your customer wants you to deviate from that process and you have it in writing, however, I would, as we were talking about with the samples that were brought in that may have deteriorated, would note your concerns on the report. And again, if you recall, I put the experts there. So, you know, if a client does not want as found data, then in fact, I would have the conversation. Then they're using, they're losing the as used data. So they have no way of knowing if the instrument was out of calibration while they were using it, and if it has an impact on perhaps the testing that they were doing. But yeah, that would definitely be a deviation. I would have a conversation with the client as to why they're making this specific request, not to have the as found data. And I would note that deviation on the report. And you being the expert, perhaps bring any concerns forward on the report that you may convey to the customer. Again, I'll send you, I am Kramer at pjlabs.com. If anybody would like a paper copy, be more than happy to, excuse me, a copy of the slides. But prior to doing that, if you go on our website, see if that's been there. We were meant to check because we were discussing doing that, because I do get a lot of requests just for the slides. I'm trying to read a couple of these others. I'm trying to, not sure if these are just questions or I'm not sure what's being asked me. I'll read you what the question says. Software or conventional is the best under the experience. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure what's being asked there. And I have two more requests here for slides. One asking for my email address. Again, M at Kramer, K-R-A-M-E-R, at pjlabs.com. Just give me a moment here. I'm going to scroll down one other time here, see if I missed anything. Somebody's asking, what does integrated system means? That means, you know, if you have electronics, and the best way I can explain to this is you have systems that are talking to each other. say your tablets and they're integrated, let's say to a server, or if you have electronic means of collecting data where your vehicles, i.e. tablets, computers, whatnot, are actually communicating and utilizing each other is the best way I can explain integrated systems. Okay, I believe I got everything. I apologize. Some of these I read out if I was missing a question in there. Again, if I missed something there, you could send it directly to me. And I have a couple more requests from my email, which is mkramer@pjlabs.com. Before I go, I'd like to go ahead and let you folks know about next month. Doing these every month, so we're getting ready to put a schedule together for the third quarter of the year as we're reaching the halfway point, believe it or not. But save the date, June 29th. We're going to look at section 710, and this is just strictly to the 2017 standard, and section 8.6 improvement. So those folks of you all, we've been sort of been going through this transition for a while. Again, the transition dates are PJLA. Everybody's going to have to transition by August 31st, 2020. I hope these webinars are a useful vehicle to help you with your transition. I hope to see everybody back next month, and be looking out for our schedule. One thing I like to be is I'm the one that's going to be putting the schedule together. If there's any topic anyone would like presented during one of our webinars, and we've been trying to keep things to the 2017 standard. So I know I've done, I think over the last, going on a year and a half now, I think I've got the whole entire standard almost covered. But if there's anything of particular interest that you would like to see presented in a webinar, shoot me an email for consideration. Kramer, Kramer, at pjlabs.com. Again, thank you all for logging in. I hope this was beneficial, and look forward to doing it again next month.